Salve omnis. Welcome to this video tutorial, chapter 19 in Wheelock's Latin. I apologize for my commentary today. I'm suffering from a bit of a head cold. Today our topics grammatically are perfect passive system, interrogative pronouns, and adjectives. What is the passive system? Well, the passive system, as was introduced in chapter 17, is a question of voice. English and Latin have two voices, active and passive. English prefers active voice, but we will see that Latin uses passive extensively. So as always, you'll want to read these descriptions of the grammar concepts. So here we have the perfect passive system. And in particular, pay attention to the paradigms and how to translate them and or read them in English. So we will be referring to these paradigms throughout our lesson today. But you can see sometimes it's possible to translate it using a form of the simple past, especially in the first person singular, but still with our participle. Other times we want to use the verb to be in some form in our passive construction. One of the challenges with this topic is learning to recognize that the participle and the verb need to be read syntactically as one unit and not to separate the participle from the main verb and read it as an adjective. And we'll explain that in the examples that we have. So as always, you want to read in your book through these descriptions and concepts and examples, and pay a particular attention to the examples, such as right here, as we go through the different tenses with the perfect passive. Once you do that, I recommend learning the vocabulary, which will be on the test. There's not a lot of vocabulary in Wheelocks, but it's important vocabulary here in bold. Argumentum, argumenti, actor, actoris, beneficium, beneficii, familia, familiae, Graecia, Graecia, Judex, Judicix, Judicium, Judicii, Scelo, sceleris, quisquid, quiquae quad, certus, certa, certum, gravis, grave, immortalis, immortale, at, contre, iam, delecto, delectare, delectavi, delectatum, libero, liberare, liberavi, liberatum, parro, parare, paravi, paratum. Also, please keep in mind, as you know, that Latin doesn't have the extensive vocabulary that English does. So sometimes in terms of what translation to use or how to read it is going to require just looking through the different possibilities. You can see many of these words in Latin have multiple definitions depending on the context. And then also the words in parentheses, these are words in English that are derived from the Latin. We also need to learn those as part of vocabulary. And on the test, you may have a derivative or two that you will need to be able to identify in terms of definition and usage. Once you do that, I recommend using the self-tutorial exercises in the back of the book, for which you also have the answers before you tackle the more demanding sententia antiquae and the longer passage. This particular chapter does not have a lot of examples, and that's good for us because it'll allow us to get more comfortable using the passive voice. And as a rule, we will focus in these lessons on the sententia antiquae and the longer passage, also paying attention to how to interpret or read it since on your exams you will have to write a short essay response about your interpretation of the meaning of these famous sentences. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Sententiae antiquae unus quae es natura animi es mortalis. So as often the case in Latin, we want to make sure we know the vocabulary. Here we start off with quae, which actually is one of our vocabulary words, also grammatical concepts. Quae, in this case, is an interrogative adjective. Earlier in the chapter, we talk about interrogative pronouns distinguished from relative pronouns, and you want to read this basically in short. Interrogative pronoun is an adjective function which asks a question, so it's pretty easy to recognize it because it has a question mark at the end, whereas the relative pronoun functions as an adjective clause and gives further information about the antecedent or some noun or object or thing in the main clause. Relative pronouns, you may recall, were introduced and practiced in an earlier chapter, chapter 17, I believe. But this is good to review the difference between the two so that we know how to read it in the context. So here is our qui, quae, quad. So we go back to, so we want to hold this in mind here. Let's go back to our example. And we have quae. So since there's a question here, we're going to say what. And the reason we're using the feminine form is natura is a feminine noun. So we need to be able to recognize the gender of the noun that it's describing. And this is from the 1st century BC Roman writer Lucretius, most famous for his long poem, philosophical poem on the nature of things. What is the nature of the mind? It is mortal. So let me go ahead and write this down, and then I will explain the grammar in further detail. So let's go back and take a look at this in some further detail. So we explained earlier, quae is the interrogative pronoun. I also pulled up Whitaker's Words as a good online resource. So we can type in quae, and you can see it has all kinds of possible options here. Once again, only the context is going to tell you. This is one of the challenges with Latin, is just trying to figure out what the words mean. But in this case, we're going to go with what, because here is basically our qui, quae, quad equivalent in this particular one. So this one may not seem like it's all that helpful, but those of you who are familiar with Whitaker's Words is definitely a resource that you want to use frequently. Est, that goes back to chapter 1. That's this third person singular, is. Nature, fairly straightforward. But then animi, here's where we can start refreshing our memory of our declension. So animus, animi. So you can see that is the genitive. So natura animi, the nature of the mind. Nominative, of course, being the subject, genitive being the possessive object. So we put that all together. What is the nature of the mind? And then quite simply, it is. So est reads as it is. And then here we simply have our predicate adjective, mortalis. Once again, if we're not quite sure, I think we all recognize it means mortal, but if we're not quite sure about the ending, we can simply use our Whitaker's Words or look in the back of our book. And in this case, it's going to be the nominative singular modifying, in this case, the subject. It is referring back to mind. That one's pretty straightforward. The philosophical context of this is a little more interesting, but with this online format, that becomes difficult to explicate without going into lecture mode. But Lucretius, famous writer, focusing on on human mortality. Long story short, he's associated with Epicureanism. Epicureanism is this ancient philosophical idea, particularly among the Romans, that we ought not to fear death or mortality because we don't really know anything about it. And so carpe diem, seize the day. Let's try to make our lives happy as best we can here in this world, since it's the only world that we know. All right, moving on to the next one. Illa argumenta visa sunt et gravi et certa by Cicero. A lot of the examples in our book are from Cicero, just because, one, he wrote the most, but two, I believe, I think this is what Wheelock was thinking. You don't need a lot of historical context or background to understand Cicero. His sentences oftentimes stand alone, so that's helpful for a foreign language in particular. So illa argumenta, this is where we want to make sure we know our vocabulary. I think this is one of our vocabulary words, if I'm not mistaken. Sure enough, argumentum, argumenti. N means neuter, not noun. So this is a neuter noun. So neuter plural is argumenta. And so if we were to look at our Whitaker's words, for example, just to confirm that, we can see here it's neuter, nominative, plural. Again, only the context will tell you what case it's being used. We have a variety of possibilities here, either proofs or arguments. Might work in this particular case. So we go back to our example here. Proof, evidence, argument. Illa means those. And then visa sunt is our perfect passive example. So this is one of the grammar concepts that's very important in Latin and is highlighted in this chapter. Important to recognize once again is that these two need to be read as a unit. Don't separate the two, because then you put it in the wrong tense. So visa participles, as your book points out, are based on the fourth principal part. And so if I were to type in first person, you can see video, videre, vidi, visus. So visa is coming from the fourth principal part, is where the participles come from. But since it is neuter plural, that's where we're adding the a, because if we look at our neuter plural, so here's our second declension, visus, nominative plural is the letter a. So this is really the beauty of Latin, but also its challenge is that Latin requires sort of multiple analytical steps in order to understand the grammar. But that is how that is the reason why visa ends in a. And then it's simply knowing what the word means, which means seemed. So those arguments or those proofs seemed. So let me go ahead and write that down first. Those proofs seemed. If you want to put arguments, that might work too. We'd have to go back and look at the original context to confirm. So those arguments seemed, and then et means both and. So both gravia means serious, and certa, where we get certain. So let's go serious and certain, just why not? Those proofs seemed both serious and certain. One of the nice things about the Wheelocks is, these concepts can be very difficult, and they are difficult, but the sentences are very short, which should help us manage them in terms of understanding. So those arguments seemed, et means both and, gravia, serious, and certain, or if you want to say true, that's fine as well. Notice we have a lot of times in Latin, no matter how long the sentence is, if you have words with the same ending or spelling, I recommend putting them together in terms of their relationship. So this one's pretty easy to recognize, but if you had really long sentences, which you can have, being able to sort them out, because Latin uses an inflected word order, can be helpful. What's the idea behind this? Well, Cicero comes from the tradition of natural law, and indeed he's one of its main developers and proponents, relying on a kind of intellectual natural intuition that you can tell if somebody's being serious, you can tell if somebody's being truthful, that right is right and wrong is wrong. We do not live in that tradition anymore. We rely more on empirical data, not our natural insights. But for Cicero, as for Christian thought after him, and even the founding fathers of our country, things were more intuitive than I think most people would admit today. Moving on to number 3. Quid nos facere contra istos et scelera erorum debimus. Again by Cicero. This one's a little bit longer. Quid, here's our interrogative pronoun. Again, one of the grammar terms in this chapter. We can see the question mark rhetorically. So quid, and then debimus, mus means we. So what should we do? So quid nos facere debimus means what should we do? So let me go ahead and write that out as a placeholder. What should we do? Contra means against, just like in English. And then what follows is always the accusative. So here we have second declension accusative plural because we have contra istos. So there's our istos. So what should we do against those men is how we can read that. Perhaps it's a reference to Catiline and his fellow conspirators. What should we do? So, contra istos, what should we do against those men and their crimes? So, eorum means there, Their, and scelera is also a neuter noun. It means crimes. So that's just simple vocabulary. We could look that up. What should we do against those men and their crimes? Again, I cannot stress enough that it's important in Latin, like in most things, to slow it down a little bit. And if we're not sure, we're going to look things up. But this is accusative, plural. In this context, crimes. I think these other things maybe missed the mark a little bit, at least in that Roman context. So let's go with crimes for that translation. Okay, moving on here. Agi. So this is a good one where we can review kind of our basic grammar here. So we have ago, agere, agi, actum. So we need to learn our principal parts. So I'll just put in the first person present singular and ago, agere, egi, actus. So the egi, which is the third principal part, is the perfect form of the verb. And sure enough, that's what we have here. So quid ego egi simply means what have I done? So let's write that down. What have I done? This one, in my experience, can be a little bit tricky, although it's fairly straightforward. But this ego egi, we need to get comfortable in learning the principal parts, and this is simply the perfect form of ago ago, which was a verb we've had earlier in the book. And then in quad, so let's focus on the participle here, on the perfect participle, since that's one of the main grammar topics in this chapter. Iactus, think of Julius Caesar, alia iacta est dies cast. Here it's in the first person singular. So have I fallen, have I fell, or have I fallen rather, or even have I been thrown, might work too. This is where we can look up our Whitaker's words to see what possibilities we have. So here's our participle. Have I been thrown? Have I been cast? Have I been? So let's maybe go with have I been thrown. Might work best in this case. So into what dangers have I been thrown? Let's explain that in a little more detail. In quad, we need to be able to recognize this as the accusative pronoun. So if I go back, I think we have this chart in our chapter. Quad. No, it's in our earlier chapter, I believe. Yes, it's not in this one. I think we'd have to go back to chapter 17. No, it's right here, quad. So in quad, qui, quai, quad. And so that's another interrogative pronoun. Thought we had that there. So the question tells us it's a question words that should help in terms of context clues. And then here also is our word right here. And then only the context will tell us, what the best reading of it is. But with a little bit of practice, it becomes a little bit more intuitive and easier. Periculum is a neuter noun. So that is to say, it's going to be the same in the singular for both the nominative and the accusative. So here we're using it as the accusative because I is the subject, so I've been thrown into this or it. So periculum is our accusative direct object in this particular case. So we put it all together is what have I done into what dangers have I been thrown. What is meant by that? Well, it's a writer by the name of Terence, who you may recall was a comedian, so it's probably not as earnest or serious as it sounds, but oftentimes in his comedies, the different characters are getting into trouble with their masters and other people, and so they're just making dumb decisions, which are comical in their effect, but that's perhaps the context of that. Okay, moving on here to more Cicero, O de immortalis, inque urbe vivimus, quam civitatem habemus, quae scalera vedimus. O immortal gods. Let me go ahead and write that down just to kind of keep that in place as we move forward. So, O immortal gods. That's just basically vocabulary. Latin, as you know, likes to put the adjective after the noun, but literally, O gods immortal, but O immortal gods. In que, this is a relative pronoun going back to chapter 17, but we should be able to recognize this A with the macron as being first declension ablative singular. So in que, and we're going to translate this as in what. So in what city. So being able to recognize this as the ablative because it's ablative of place is pretty important. Once again, if we're not quite sure on this, we may have to use Whitaker's words, although in this particular case, it's probably not going to help us too much if we don't already have a sense of what we're trying to understand. So, but in urbe, so notice that in here's ablative, first declension. Here's ablative, third declension, because the word city is third declension. So if we look at third declension ablative singular, we can see that is the letter E. So we put it all together is in que urbe. It means in what city. So I'm going to go ahead and write that down while it's still fresh. In what city? And then we have vivimus, which this is just basic vocabulary, but it might be a good idea to refresh our memory. Here's present active indicative, and mus, of course, means we. So it means in what city do we live is how that reads there. In what city? Cicero probably is talking about the collapse of the Roman Republic. And so he's asking his fellow Romans to reconsider whether or not it still is a republic or not. In what city do we live? Quam civitatem habemus. Urbe, urbs means city, civitas means state. And here's quam civitatem, both in the accusative. So this is first declension accusative singular, namely am, but then we have civitatem, which is third declension accusative singular, just because state is third declension, whereas what in this case is simply just in the accusative form, first declension form rather. The reason for that is that state is feminine, and so we're using the feminine form of the interrogative pronoun versus the masculine if state were a different gender. And then scalera we had earlier in number 3. So what crimes do we see? That's how that reads there. So what crimes do we see? Fairly straightforward. So quae scalera. Scalera again is a neuter noun, as we said earlier. So we need the a there, just because accusative plural for neuter nouns is the letter a, as you can see. And then vedimus is simply we see, but in this case, Latin doesn't use do or does. So what crimes do we see? Again, the idea being there is people have a conscience, but they're not using it, and just turn the other eye. Well, that seems to be problematic for Cicero's notion of civic mindedness and civic virtue. Okay, moving on to number 6. Qui sunt boni civis nisi ei qui officio moventur beneficia patria memoriae tenet. Also by Cicero. Qui means who, so that is our plural form of our, in this case, it's actually functioning as just a relative pronoun. So who, what, where, that sort of thing. So who are good citizens? And so let me go ahead and write that out first, and then I'll say a little bit about it and move forward. So who are good citizens? It's fairly straightforward. Qui sunt boni civis. Boni is second declension nominative plural. So boni, but then citizen is third declension. So as you know, one of the challenges in Latin is keeping track what declension a noun or word belongs to. It just depends. Only looking words up in a dictionary or learning the words in terms of the declensions is how you have to approach it. But hopefully we've seen these words enough where we have some recollection that boni is masculine and citizens is third, and so that's boni cives. So who are good citizens? Nisi is simply means except, so it's simply just being used as a preposition. This part is a little bit tricky. Except those who are moved by duty. Let me write this out and then I'll explain it here. This one is a little bit tricky. It helps to chunk Latin, if you will. So once we have that, we have unless those who, and then moventur's third person plural, agreeing with qui. So are moved or are being moved. And so that is simply present passive, aris tuum mune nuntur. Once again, if we're not sure, we're going to have to do a little bit of analysis or just work to look these up. So present passive indicative. So are moved is probably how I would translate this or read this rather. But then by duty, and so that is the ablative of means. So officio, because officio is second declension, so second declension ablative plural is o. So officio means by duty. One of the challenges with the ablative, of course, is getting the right preposition, but oftentimes by, from, or with, if you trial and error one of those three, you'll get the right equivalent in English. So who are those who are good citizens except those who are moved by duty? And this could mean retain or even keep. And keep and retain by memory the benefits of the fatherland. So this one's a little bit trickier to translate. So let me give my translation, then I'll try to explain it here. And maybe keep instead of retain. We keep by memory the benefits. Could also mean good offices. Beneficium, as we'll see, is kind of not tricky to translate, but oftentimes it just loses a little bit in its translation. And then patriae is first declension genitive singular, so we're going to say of the fatherland for that one. Who are good citizens except those who are moved by duty and keep by memory the benefits of the fatherland. So let me try to explain that last part a little bit. So, and keep, tenants, that's simply third person plural. And then by memory, because we need to be able to recognize this as first declension ablative singular because we have our macron. So there it is, memoriae. But then beneficia is a neuter noun. We've had a number of these in this chapter. So second declension neuter accusative plural is the letter A. So beneficia, once again, if we're not sure on that, we're going to look it up, but you're going to see that it is a neuter noun coming from beneficium, beneficii. And so here's our context. Only the context will tell you how it's more precisely being used. That's true of most things, of course. Context matters. And so we have beneficia. And so that's going to be, it could be kindness, benefits, rights. And so I'm going to go with benefits on that. The main idea is almost, and keep by memory what our forefathers did before us, is sort of the sense of it. In other words, their goodwill, their good deeds, their good actions to what got us to this point, in terms of still believing that we're living in a country worth living in. Seems to be Cicero's point, namely a republic. All right, moving on to the last one. So here we have alia, which means like some things or other things. So some things, quae pecuniae perantur ab eos stulto parata sunt at mores eos veros amicus parare non potuerant. Once again, this one is a little bit, not tricky, but it's going to require, just kind of slowing it down. So some things or other things which are provided for by money. So let me write that down. So some things, or it could be other things too, which are provided by money. So other things which are provided by money. So there's our ablative again, because pecuniae, so by money. And then parata sunt. So here's a good example between the present passive and the perfect passive. So present passive doesn't have the auxiliary verb of to be. So here we have parantur, which is present passive. And again, if we're not sure, we have to look it up. So here we go, present passive. But we have another example in our sentence of parata. So if I type in the participle here, you can see it's a verbal participle of passive, as you can see here. So passive. And so this is a great example of the differences between the two. And we need to be precise in our reading and translation. Alia, so other things which are provided by money, have been provided by that fool. So have been provided, parata sunt, versus are provided. So have been provided by that fool. And we're stupid man. Have But then we're not done with the sentence. But, so at means but. This is where we get the word mores. In this case, it can mean character. But his character was not able to provide true friends. So let me write that down and then I'll explain it. Okay, we can type here. So, all right. So let me explain that in a little more detail. But his eos means either his or her. So just sort of keep that in mind. Most of the time it means his in our book, but his literally mores, probably character is probably the best thing since we're talking about one person. But his character, and then non potu eront. So e istit, imos istis eront. So there is the perfect form of possum, so we could look that up, was not able to provide. And then veros amicos, because that is second declension accusative plural, veros amicos. So there's our direct object. And once again, this is a good short chapter where we need to, maybe tidy up our form of verbs, our principal parts of possum, posse, potui. And so here's the perfect form, because I believe this was a verb introduced in chapter 1. All right, so what's the idea behind that? Well, you can buy power, but you can't buy friends. All right, and then we have our longer passage, and so we'll just call this the Sophocles passage. Sophocles, of course, was one of the great Greek writers. The Romans always admired the Greeks for their intellectual achievements. Cicero himself sent his son Marcus to Athens, as you may know, for education. And let's go ahead and take a look at this here. Quam multa senis in mentibus tenent, si studium gravit labora probitas in senectate remanent, saepe manent etiam memoria scientiae sapientiae. Sophocles scripto illa Graecus ad summam senectatem tragioties faecit. Se propter hoc studium familiam neglegere vidibatur et a filius in judicium vocatus est, tum alter eam tragodiam quam secum habuit et quam proxime scripts erat, edipum colonium Euripus recitavit. Ubi haec tragodia recita est senex sententiis judicium est liberatus. So this is from Cicero's De Senectate. They do give us a little bit of vocabulary, a little bit of context. But again, here's the main question. Wheelocks ideally would be better for in-person classes because the book is set up where we could debate and discuss how to interpret this. Here we can only give passing comments, and you have to think about these things on your own and possibly reflect in writing on the test. So what's going on here? Well, I mean, let's start with the context first. Cicero is following the Greeks and emphasizing the importance of wisdom over power. Again, something our founding fathers in our country also had in large measure, namely wisdom. So they had lots of money and they had power relative to their society, but they definitely had wisdom. And so to have a republic, you need wisdom, you need wise citizens. You do not need wisdom for other forms of government. So we can learn that lesson today, perhaps. So let's go back to the Latin here. Quam multa senis in mentibus tenent. So literally, how much? So how much old people hold in their minds. So again, he's a reference to wisdom. So how much old people, it could be old men too, but okay, old men retain or keep in their minds. Again, the idea here is that you need experience for wisdom. So elder people may lack the physical strength of young people, but what they lack in physical strength, they compensate for in terms of their wisdom. Si studium gravit laboret probitas in senectute remanent. So si means if. So grave studium means serious study. So we have kind of a longer clause here, but if serious study and work and honesty remain in old age, let me write that first. Serious study, work, and honesty. Okay, serious study. All right, so if serious study and work and honesty remain, remanent, in senectute, in old age. So it's important to recognize once again, in senectute is third declension ablative singular, because senex, senis is any word that ends in x, which senex does, senex, is third declension, like lex or rex. And then remanent, we've had before, remain in old age. Saipe means often. So often also memory, knowledge, and wisdom remain. So often also memory, not science, but knowledge and wisdom remain. So this is a meditation on the importance of wisdom for a republic. So often also, saipe etiam, memory, knowledge. Que means and, wisdom, remain. We got third person plural form of the verb because here we have memory, science, and wisdom. Sophocles, that Greek writer, so let's go ahead and write this. Sophocles, ille, that Greek writer. Sophocles, that Greek writer. And then here's our verb, facit, which is the past tense of facios. So we should, again, these basic verbs in particular, we really should have in memory at this point. So you can see if I type in the present tense, we have facio, facere, faci, factus. So here is our third principal part. That's where we get the word fact. And so feci, but here we're talking about Sophocles, so we need third person singular. So we have facit. So here in this case, made tragedies. If you want to say wrote tragedies, that's probably better English, but I'll keep it literal. So made tragedies into old age. Made into old age. Then we have a semicolon, but propter hoc, sed means but because of this or on account of this. So, but on account of this, so propter hoc. He was seeming, so vedibator is actually the imperfect passive because we have the ba. He was seeming to neglect his family. So this is a new verb for us, vedibator, but we'll just take a little time out here, or detour rather, and you can see this is imperfect passive. third person singular, again referring back to he was appearing or was seeming, referring back to Sophocles. The idea, of course, is he's busy working. If you're a genius like Sophocles, it's probably hard to be Father of the Year. And so that's maybe the sense of it here. He was seeming to neglect his family and was called. So vocatus est. So here's our grammar in this chapter. Very important. Vocatus est. We got to be able to recognize those two as a unit, because if we say is called, that would be wrong and you would lose points on the test. So vocatus est was called by his sons into the court. So his sons have apparently levied a complaint against the court or against their father in court. Filiis, that is second declension ablative plural. So there's our is, filiis. Could be by his children too. We're not sure on the context down here. I don't know enough about his biography to know if it's his sons or sons and daughters. So we'll just say by his sons. Then the author. So auctor means author in this case. So tum means then. Then the author, that was referring to Sophocles, had that tragedy with him that he had written recently. So this one, so the idea is that he went to court, and then he had that tragedy with him that he had written scripts erat recently. So let me write this out and then I'll explain it. Okay, so he had with him that tragedy, that quam he had written recently. So scripts erat, this is pluperfect. So just kind of go back to basic grammar. If I type in scribo, which is present tense, but then we look at the third principal part, but then we add eram, res, erat, eramos, erates, erat. We need the irregular form of to be at the end of it, and this is pluperfect, as you can see, and we translate that as had written. So pluperfect, one tense before simple past. So before I moved to Chicago, I had lived in Phoenix, would be an example in English of that. English is often not as precise as Latin in terms of verb tenses and sequence of tenses, but Latin requires a little more precision, at least in writing. Okay, so, and then he recited Oedipus Colonium. He recited Oedipus Colonium to the judges. So he read his tragedy to the judges. He recited, I'll just abbreviate this, Oedipus Colonius to Colonium to the judges. And then, so let's talk about this. So he recited, we need to be able to recognize this as past tense because there's the VIT, so recited. And then judges is third declension because it's iudex. So third declension dative plural is ibus. So there it is. To the judges is ibus, iudicibus. So to the judges. And then when he recited this tragedy. So when he recited this tragedy. When he So when ubi, he recited recitata est. So here's our perfect passive participle again, construction. So that's important in this chapter. Recited, and then haec tragedia, this tragedy. The old man was freed. So senex est liberatus. So there's another example of perfect passive voice and grammar construction. So perfect passive. So the old man was freed or was liberated. So liberatus est. And then here we have ablative of separation. Why? Because sententia means judgment or opinions. So first declension ablative plural is is. So he was freed from the sentiis. But then of the judges, notice that is So we go from this, of this. That's why judges ends in in terms of our Latin here, judicum So he was freed from the could be sentences too, but from the judgments or from the opinions of the judges. This might not be the right legal vocabulary for back then, but you get the idea. He was freed from the sententiis judicium of the judges, is how that works there. Sententiis, this is where we can see if we have other possibilities. Oops. I guess from the sentences might work too, just because in law we have sentences, if you will, freed from the sentences of the judges. All right, so that is it for this chapter. As always, let me know if you have any questions about the content, and we will continue next week with chapter 20 and fourth declension nouns, which is right here, us, ui, u, and so forth, and also more ablatives. Valete.